Why don't we have all our speakers come up now, just so we'd be able to save some time. And instead of doing introductions, which would take time, we'll have each of our speakers who will introduce themselves briefly. I'm refining my comments as well. Many people may recall seeing footage of Robert Frost one time when he was going to give a great speech. And when he got up there, the wind came and blew away half of his speech. And he said it was all better for all of you. I'm doing much the same here. But I do want to note that I have the honor of representing two beautiful communities in Massachusetts. Many of you are around the nation. My two communities, Marshfield and Scituate, not only are they beautiful, but they have the distinction of having the highest percentage of Irish Americans in the country, which makes us, we affectionately call ourselves the Irish Riviera. But we also now are known as being the tip of the spear in the issue of storm adaptation in Massachusetts. And one of my comments from today, as Bill knows, we want to make sure that we get this right, because as we have been doing storm adaptation, that we have two hopeful stories here, but one cautionary tale, because as my good friends here from Senator Markey's office, from Senator Warren's office, Congressman Keating, Congressman Lynch, the new FEMA flood maps, insurance rates, those can cause just as much damage, global damage and economic damage, as some of these storms that we are trying to prepare ourselves for. My brief comments. I've been a state representative for 5 years here in Massachusetts. It's the greatest honor of my professional life. In this time, representing two coastal communities, we have an alphabet soup of agencies that we deal with. Folks here would know we have DCR that deals with seawalls, CZM with beach nourishment, DOT with our transportation issues, FEMA, obviously, federally, and Army Corps. There has not been any cohesive organization to pull all these thoughts together for adaptation. And that's why I credit you, Bill Golden, for pulling this kind of organization together, because this is a phenomenal, phenomenal tool. As far as a regional approach, as we learned today, this is a joke, but I like to say the last time that our towns of Marshfield, Duxbury, and Scituate worked together collectively was the Revolutionary War. That has changed, though, with the tremendous work of some of our leaders who are here today. Paul Halkiotis, who's a town planner from Marshfield, Andre Martacchini, who is a former selectman from Scituate, and one of our speakers who's going to speak in just one moment, who is Rick Murray from the town of Scituate. The final comment I want to say, we have heard a lot of discussion today about national leaders and what they've done in the past. I hope we haven't lost that kind of thing. People talked about President Eisenhower, and Bill mentions about the need to have something on the scope of the federal interstate highway system to have this new coastal adaptation plan. People mentioned John F. Kennedy and John F. Kennedy's plans of going to the moon, not because it was easy, Rick, as you said, or as he would say, because it is hard. We need that same kind of federal commitment to do the great work that each of our speakers today were pointing out to make sure that we can do adaptation for coastal storms. I'm so thrilled to be a part of this organization with Nichi, and I look forward to each one of these speakers to speak in line. I think I do not know if we're just going to follow right along the way that the forum was done together, or you want to start with you, Bruce? Bruce, why don't we just start with you? We'll go right in line. Bruce Berman, Save the Harbor, Save the Bay.
Thank you, Jim, and particularly thanks to Bill Golden. As I look around the room, I think that there's a good number of us who owe our careers and also owe a debt of gratitude to Bill, who's been ahead of the curve for more decades than he'd like to admit or that I'd like to count. I guess I've been asked to keep it to 3 minutes, and I just want to make 3 brief points. And frankly, it starts with a criticism of all of us. As we sit around and we find ourselves in the position that we're in right now, and except for Lewis, as we sit in the room, we find ourselves in a situation that, in some ways, we're responsible for. I feel sort of directly responsible for it in some ways, because I was one of the leading advocates, in the fight against nuclear power in the United States. I, of course, blame General Electric and a number of other companies for making it necessary for us to put what could have actually made a difference on hold for 30 years. And I think we need to have a frank discussion about nuclear power. But here's what I think we can't afford to do. We cannot afford to just focus on mitigation and to throw up our hands and to use shorthand to go, Tea Party, China, what can we do? We just can't afford to do that. We have a responsibility to begin to have some frank discussions about ways that we can reduce greenhouse gases that we know are responsible for the situation that we're in. Tipping point or no tipping point. And to let the feds off the hook or to let the political system off the hook, it would be a crime. And I just don't think that people are going to let it happen. That conversation is extremely unpleasant right now. It's not satisfying. It doesn't look like you can turn to international tribunals. I'll be surprised if what happened in the Philippines this weekend, results in a sudden, global response to climate change that in a week or two makes everything go away. And I'm also be surprised if we see some innovative legislation that comes out of Congress in the next few months while we're all trying to sign on to the Obamacare site. But that said, we cannot let denial, we cannot let, political hoo-ha keep us from acknowledging the fact that there's still more work to do there. That said, it would be imprudent and frankly short-sighted and ridiculous not to have the conversation that Bill is starting to lead, and I want to thank him for that. That's one. The second caveat is to those of us who think that protecting the built environment, particularly, and I don't want to talk about Boston because I live here, but protecting Wall Street, for example, or Manhattan is going to, result in, a future that's bright and rosy as Long Island and the Connecticut shoreline is washed away. You're crazy. This is a problem whose scope and whose magnitude is ginormous. I was talking to Joe before and also to John Sullivan. The thing I like best about the scale of the problem that we're dealing here is, the Boston Harbor cleanup was just a few $1 billion, which seemed like a lot of money at the time. But in the context that we're looking at today, it's orders of magnitude smaller. And that said, it's going to require a federal response. Now, if there was only a storm that was big enough to put the whole country at risk at once, then we'd all have no trouble selling the estimated $28 trillion, and I'm not making it up. Of course, I didn't use trusted sources when I got the number. But the ginormous cost of addressing these problems. What's going to happen is if you pick 20 port cities and you make the infrastructure investments in them, and there's economists in the room that can make the argument better than I can. It's clearly a great strategy, but if we only lose one of them every 50 years, you have people that are going to be arguing against that kind of investment, and we can't afford to do that. I mean, all politics is local, but solving this problem is not just a local situation, and it can't be a hyper-local situation. If we're successful and we fortify the harbor walk and turn it into a harbor wall and, come up with ways to reduce the size of our, exposure here in Boston, build a wall across the harbor. If we do all that and Revere to Nantasket is wiped out, it's not going to be a very pleasant place to live. It's not going to be a high quality of life, and it's not going to be the community that I want to be a part of. So, the solution is going to be top down and bottoms up, and we can't afford to leave anybody out of the mix. Just one last comment. I was lucky enough to be with Mayor Menino and Julie and some others at the aquarium last week when the city, took some credit, well-deserved credit, for being way ahead of the curve in many areas in the Green City Initiative. But as I stood there and I looked from the aquarium to my office, which is on Boston's Fish Pier, take a good look at it because it won't be there if Sandy hit 10 hours earlier or 10 hours later. As I looked towards it, I was struck by the fact that although there were some people in the room who are here now that, and I'm going to probably get in trouble when I get home for calling this out, but that Massport wasn't there, that Fidelity wasn't there, that the Fallon companies weren't there, that the GSA weren't there, that the Intercontinental Hotel wasn't there, that the Children's Museum wasn't there, that Atlantic Wharf wasn't there, that the owners of Rose Wharf weren't there, and that the owners of the Marriott Long Wharf were not there. And unless we can get a true involvement from the business community and engagement from federal officials, and the kind of investments that this is going to take are not going to happen. And we desperately want them to happen. And we need to have them happen. Thank you.
My name is Joe Favaloro. I'm the Executive Director of the Massachusetts Water Resource Authority Advisory Board. I represent the cities and towns, the 60 of them that have paid the bills of the MWRA. As I listened to all of the words today, it really basically led me to, the first thing we all need to do is kind of like throw away all our perceived ideas and notions. because they don't exist anymore. The 100-year storm doesn't occur every 100 years, it's every other year. Climate is, you got to really believe that the wet times are going to be wetter and the dry times are going to be even drier. And that's how you have to design and look at things from this day forward. At the MWRA, and in no small way, we almost need to thank Mr. Golden, because he actually allowed us the first adaptation project in the country that went concrete, and that's Deer Island. Because when we built Deer Island, we were able to use the best available information at the time, and we raised Deer Island by 2 feet. The seawalls are higher. All of the infrastructure around it can survive much of what we've talked about today. But that's just one case. Amongst the rest of the MWRA projects, working cooperatively with Boston Harbor Associates, we looked at the 30 physical plants of the MWRA and evaluated them not only with the 100-year storm, but with the 100-year storm plus 2.5 feet. And we got different results going through each and every one of them. Most of the MWRA projects aren't at a severe risk, but there are many of them that have a moderate risk. And from there, they had the MWRA, under Mr. Lasky's guidance and leadership, was able to put together plans for each and every one of them. For the most part, there's what I would call best management practices. The day-to-day stuff that you can do right now. I mean, it's silly stuff. I mean, to some extent, it's stop logs on garage doors, it's storm doors on windows. It's also, as each construction project comes forward, an evaluation committee that takes a look and determines exactly what you need to make them as safe as possible as you move forward. And that'll happen over the next 15 to 20 years. On the water side, people long before us really did Greater Boston the greatest of favors on Earth, is that the Quabbin and the Wachusett Reservoir, with their great insights, if you believe that the wet is going to be wetter and drier is going to be drier, we have a reservoir system that can pretty much absorb pretty much anything that nature throws at us. For instance, if it were not to rain for 1 day over the next 6 years, we would still have an adequate supply of water. So we can provide water for the greater Boston area under many different cycles. But the message truly out of today is that we all need to remain vigilant, we need to develop plans, and we need to move forward. And to agree with Bruce, we can't allow the federal government to take a walk. We need a partner, and that partner has to be the federal government, because you're right. Boston Harbor Project and all those related were billions of dollars. I don't know how many more zeros this will bring to us, so thank you.
Thank you. My name is Rick Murray, and I'm here wearing several hats. I'm an elected selectman in the town of Scituate. For you people in Massachusetts, you're well aware that Scituate gets the stuffing knocked out of it every Northeaster. For you folks from out of state, Scituate gets the stuffing knocked out of it every Northeaster. You're probably seen our town because we actually get national news. We have everybody in their TV trucks show up all the time. It doesn't rain cats and dogs, it rains reporters and TV trucks. Also, I'm a professor of oceanography at Boston University, and my expertise is in climate change and natural cycles thereof, and a little bit of the modern as well. So I kind of bring a scientific hat to the political discussion as well, which is in fact why I got involved in politics to begin with. I have a few comments about today and about the larger issue, reflecting both small-scale local issues as well as the national agenda, which is the main subject here. One is, we've heard a lot of conversations about money, and it is true that a lot of these projects we're talking about will in fact cost a heck of a lot of money, but there are some things that we can do at the local level that don't cost anything at all, other than political cost of trying to get local town meetings and so on to make some changes. And this is namely in things like zoning and environmental regulations about how close to waterways you can build your houses and so on and so forth. And these shouldn't be lost in the national conversation, even though the action item is at the local level. If there were state incentives and federal incentives for funding or so on, then I think a lot of towns would be more enabled and more prone to enact some of these local changes in zoning and so on. And that's a very important point, because all politics is local, but everybody does live in a town or a city somewhere. And yes, we're all United States citizens and so on, but we all pay our local taxes first and foremost as well. So I don't think that should be lost. That would also benefit from national and state coordination and ideas and suggestions for us all. But I don't think that point has been emphasized enough, and I think should be considered. Secondly, with the pendulum swinging to the other side of the question, is the point that, yeah, this is a huge issue. But I don't think we should be intimidated by the scale of the issue. I think we should embrace it. In fact, if you look at legislation that Mr. Cantwell was essential to getting enacted here in Massachusetts, involving a bond bill to help build some or maintain seawalls. It also brought together people from the western part of the state who are interested in removal of dams to enhance the environmental quality and fish runs and so on and so forth. So if we look at this as just a coastal problem, then we're going to really limit our constituency. And I think everybody in this room understands that the larger issue here is climate change. And just like in Massachusetts, we have coastal climate change issues, and we have issues in the western part of the state. And the gentleman earlier referred to the fact that Vermont is not a coastal community, but it got hammered during Irene. I think at the national level, we need to bring in people from the Mississippi River Valley, and not just New Orleans, but people in Iowa, people in Indiana, people in all those other areas as well, because climate change affects them just as much as it does us. In admittedly a very different way, but it's still part and parcel of the whole meal, as it were. So we need to continue to build our constituencies in that way. Also, two other quick points. I do think looking at insurance is very important, but also inheritance laws also need to be looked at. And again, this is potentially something that could be low-hanging fruit and doesn't cost much money. But the incentive these days, and I am speaking from the coastal perspective, but the incentive these days is strongly towards handing off our coastal property down to our children. And while that might be good for that family, it certainly doesn't solve the problem for the town. You just have a different owner owning the same house that's going to get slammed in the next northeaster or the next hurricane. And if we can change the conversation about the incentives from the insurance side, from the inheritance side, from the regulatory side, and it's going to take a patchwork of issues so that we're not sitting here in 30 years having this exact same conversation with a bunch of different people who aren't even born yet. And then lastly, yes, we've talked about infrastructure, but it was encouraging, of course, to see the example from the Netherlands, where they've been practicing what we've been calling here only recently managed retreat. No one likes to hear it, but the fact of the matter is we're not going to be able to armor everywhere. We're not going to be able to drain everywhere. There are going to need to be very real hard choices about what areas we're going to need to protect and what areas we are, in fact, going to have to walk away from. And this does not mean, and as a local politician, I will reassure you, I do get my head cut off every so often when I bring this subject up, so I want to be very clear. We need to preserve equity as we build in managed retreat. We're not talking about next Thursday at 3:15, everybody's going to get out, but we're talking about generational changes. There's a little beach in Scituate called Peggotty Beach, which used to have about 55, 60 homes on it. And then the blizzard of 78, which is our storm of record around here, blizzard of 78 came by and took out about 15 to 20 of those homes. Several Northeasters since then have whacked out about 5 or 8 more. And now there's about 14 or so homes on Peggotty Beach. So in 1977, there were about 50 homes. And right now in 2010, whoops, 2013, there are about 15. So that's a generational change. That's managed retreat. People were able to maintain their equity through one form or another, but the landscape, figuratively and physically, has changed dramatically. And that's something that we also need to look at, I think, over the long term as well. We're not going to be able to protect everything. We have to have a whole menu of approaches to solve this problem. Thank you very much to Jim and to Bill for having me here, and for all the presenters and everybody else. There have been very fascinating conversations during coffees and lunches as well. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Richard Delaney. I'm the president of the Center for Coastal Studies in Provincetown. It's good to be back with all of our colleagues, and I'm pleased that you mentioned Situate. That's the home of the famous seawall that has been rebuilt 19 times with FEMA money. But however, the nice side of the coin is that same FEMA, there's a small provision in FEMA that allowed 15 of those houses to be given 105% of their pre-damaged value to get off Peggotty Beach. So it's a great example. But I want to talk to you about 3 examples of why we on Cape Cod are very, very excited that Bill and Kristen and Dwayne Morris and others are promoting this idea of this focus on coastal infrastructure, as we have our needs as well. First one is wastewater infrastructure. We on the Cape are dealing with basically a Boston Harbor deja vu situation. We've discovered that our embayments in our marshes and harbors are being overloaded with nutrients, and eutrophication is getting ahead of it. And it is not only an environmental issue, but a big economic issue. The Chamber of Commerce is actually leading the charge to deal with wastewater. And the Cape Cod Commission is doing a very nice job in trying to plan around a watershed basis on a regional effect. But the numbers probably will mean somewhere between $3.5 billion and $6.5 billion of infrastructure. Big range so far, but a lot of us are hopeful that 2 factors will drive it toward the $3.5 billion. The more we can incorporate biomimicry or using natural bioengineering as a way to reduce it and not have to build expensive engineered infrastructure, we can go to that lower end. And our friends at UMass Boston, Anna Marie Frankic and others have been helping us think that through. We also are working with the agencies, EPA, DEP, and local authorities to open up the thinking and the regulations about innovative and alternative technologies and techniques, because the more of those we can incorporate, we think we can also reduce that cost. So we're at a very important part of our planning process, but either way, it's going to cost a lot, and we really are going to need more than just the ratepayers on Cape Cod, who only number 250,000. That quadruples in the summer and really puts the pressure on us. But it's unlike the 2.5 million people who are paying for the Boston Harbor $4 billion. So you can see when you put the numbers side by side, we've got a huge challenge here, and we are going to need federal and state help.
750,000 of them come from Boston and have summer homes on the Cape.
That's true. And we're going to quadruple their rates. The second type of infrastructure is like every place else. We have our share of antiquated bridges and roads. The most antiquated are the 2 most important bridges that go over the Cape Cod Canal that bring our economic lifeblood to the Cape and affect most of our daily lives. I drove over one this morning that was built in 1955. It's being maintained or repaired yet again, therefore the backups. Those will have to be dealt with. That's a big infrastructure problem. And it's not only just an economic lifeblood, it might be actually a lifeline for some of us on Cape Cod, because we have a nuclear power plant. Bruce put this thought in my mind. We started talking about nuclear power, sitting 23 miles across Cape Cod Bay, that has now reached the top of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission's list for troublesome plants. And should there ever be an emergency there, the prevailing westerly winds take everything to Cape Cod. We'll have, if it's a summer especially, 1.5 million people trying to get over 2 antiquated bridges to get off the Cape. Recipe for disaster. So another huge infrastructure need there. And the third one is and this is a kind of a national issue as well, the government is probably, I would venture, the largest landowner of coastal property between the military bases, the Navy bases, and and national parks. In fact, a quick aside, I believe I heard correctly in a previous conference that the Navy has 32 Navy bases around the world that are, most of the base is at sea level or no more than a meter above sea level. So there's a national security issue attached squarely to infrastructure. But on Cape Cod, our national infrastructure is part of the Cape Cod National Seashore. We've had already an experience back in 1978 when our most famous local storm, the blizzard of '78, wiped out the largest beach. Rather than rebuild in the same place, the Park Service very smartly moved the beach back to an existing parking lot and is now shuttling people into the beach. We're about to do the same thing in Herring Cove Beach up in Provincetown, where again we're building infrastructure like bathhouses that can be moved back as sea level rises and the environment changes. So there's some, again, need for dealing with infrastructure in a smart way, and that involves, my last point, you need good science to inform these decisions. For example, in those Cape Cod National Seashore beaches, and probably most coastlines, we can identify areas where we think the heaviest impact from sea level rise and from storm events will be, but you really need to know what the sea bottom is like off those beaches. We need to understand, and my Center for Coastal Studies is doing some very advanced high-resolution mapping of the entire perimeter of Cape Cod National Seashore, because there are places that are more vulnerable, although it doesn't appear from the standing on the beach, because of the lack of deposits off that beach. So if you understand the coastal processes, which are complex, that will inform where your most vulnerable spots are going to be, and of course you can direct your infrastructure there. Also, I'd encourage Bill and the group to not only go after federal money, but I think this is part of the agenda, make sure we're looking at federal policy. Federal and state policy, as was said by our selectman from Situate, can be a non-cost but benefit as well. So we have to look at good science, good policy, and the dollars to address our infrastructure needs along the coastline. Thanks.
Thank you, Rich. My name is Jack Wiggin. I'm the director of the Urban Harbors Institute at the University of Massachusetts in Boston, just across the way here. The last speaker of the day in a program that has been very comprehensive and thorough, and so one might wonder what I could possibly talk about, but I'll think of something. I'm a planner by training, and so much of what the Institute does has focused on coastal planning and waterfront planning, harbor planning. The Institute has probably done 20 or 25 harbor plans or waterfront plans over the course of our existence. Rich was the director prior to I, so this will all sound very familiar to him. But as we went through those plans for all those number of years, climate change, sea level rise, coastal flooding, storm surges was never a big part of that plan. It all had to do with what those economic activities were going on the coast and what the protection of the natural resources were as an important element of what was going on in the plan. In recent years, the last 3 or 4 years, of course, it has become the primary issue that's driving a lot of these plans. I want to talk about the town of Marshfield for a moment, one because Representative Cantwell is our moderator and Paul Halkiotis, the town planner, is in the room, and they've been engaged in a regional effort to better understand the impacts of climate change on their coastline. They, on their own initiative, have attracted a couple of small grants, the towns of Situate, Marshfield, and Duxbury, to look at vulnerability of the coastline and to begin to look at what some of the adaptation steps are that are appropriate for towns of that size. Marshfield is engaged in an update of its comprehensive plan. We're working with the community on a harbor, rivers, and waterways plan, and it will have a strong climate change adaptation element to it. There's not a great deal that towns can do on an individual basis in terms of climate change mitigation, but they are on the forefront of what's going to need to be adaptation measures to combat climate change and storm surges. So Marshfield's plan, and it's the first one I've seen actually in the coastal area, will have a chapter on climate change adaptation, and our waterfront plan will similarly reflect that. We're working on a plan for Southampton, New York. Again, we've been at it for about 18 months. Until Sandy hit, climate change was not high on the agenda for that plan either. Suddenly, it became the primary thing that plan will cover. Southampton, very much like the Cape Cod communities, soft shoreline, not hard infrastructure is not appropriate and would be ineffective and over the long run probably counterproductive. So their focus really is on what to do about the movement of the sand that goes along the barrier beaches, ends up in the estuaries, affecting the shellfish resources, the eelgrass beds, and so forth. And they're dredging that sand out and putting it back on the beach as a short-term measure. But that needs to be given much longer-term consideration into what the appropriate response to sea level rise will be in that case. I'll switch gears and talk about we're involved in an effort now for Port of Massachusetts strategic plan for the 5 major ports in Massachusetts: Gloucester, Salem, Boston, Fall River, and New Bedford. For the first time, those ports are coming together under something called the Ports Compact, led by the mayors of each of those communities and the secretariats of several of the agencies under the governor. And that port plan, for the first time, will attempt to coordinate the infrastructure investments that are going to occur in those 5 ports and probably focus the investments that will take place there, as well as take a and so what that says to me is it's going to take a long-term view of what those ports are going to be doing in years to come. Again, climate change was not one of the drivers of that plan, but climate change clearly is going to influence what the infrastructure investments are made for each of those ports and the direction that each of those ports go in. The final example I'll use is working with some colleagues out of the School for the Environment at UMass Boston on a couple of studies that have to do with the impact on environmental justice communities of sea level rise and climate change. Not a lot of thought is necessarily given to that, but NOAA, for its perspective, wanted to know what communities of color, environmental change, environmental justice communities thought or knew about climate change and what they would think about in terms of this range of adaptation strategies that are considered amongst people like us that have access to forums like this to go to. So we did a couple of social science, really, research projects in Everett and East Boston to try to better understand what the impacts of climate change, sea level rise will be on those communities and find out how those people would react to some of the strategies that have been proposed. And that information then is fed back into the federal government to help them refine their policies as they're implemented in urban areas on the coastline. That's all I have to say. Thank you.